Today we will be looking at two horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. The second one in particular is an incident which will put you at unease, since the victims in it went through a terrible experience of being buried alive inside a narrow crawl space. As always, viewer discretion is advised. On May 11, 1990, in the remote wilderness of Hernando County, Florida, the waters of Deipolder Sink No. 2 lay still, concealing one of the largest and most treacherous underwater cave systems in the state. Few had dared to explore its full depths, where the world turned black and the pressure of the abyss wrapped around the human body like an unrelenting force. At the water's edge, Michael Spears knelt beside his gear, double-checking every strap and hose. At 25 years old, he was an ambitious and skilled diver, but nowhere near as seasoned as his companion, Daniel. Michael had completed his cave diving certification just 5 months earlier, but he had already logged 75 cave dives. The sport fascinated him. How a person could navigate an alien world beneath the surface, squeezing through tight tunnels and gliding through cathedral-like chambers of submerged rock formations. Tonight, Michael and Daniel planned to dive into the lower circuit of Deipolder Sink. The visibility was poor. Recent rains had stirred up the sediment. But that didn't deter them. Michael had never dived this site before, and the challenge excited him. He wanted to prove he could handle the depths, just like the veterans he admired. A few feet away, Daniel was methodically preparing his own equipment. At 34, he was the more experienced of the two, with over a decade of cave diving under his belt. He had seen his fair share of mishaps, some minor, others fatal. Cave diving wasn't just about skill, it was about discipline. A single mistake, a moment's panic, could mean the difference between life and death. "Last check," Daniel said, his voice steady. "You good?" Michael exhaled sharply, gripping his regulator. "Yeah, let's do this." The two men stepped into the water, their movements deliberate and slow. Deipolder Sink opened up beneath them like a gateway to another world. The entrance restriction, a narrow passage leading into the main cavern, was their first challenge. They maneuvered through it with precision, their headlights slicing through the murky water. By the time they reached the junction room, the visibility had worsened. The silt, disturbed by recent rains, swirled around them like an underwater sandstorm. The glow of their lights barely extended beyond their arms. They navigated cautiously, following the guideline, a thin rope that was their lifeline in the cave. In zero visibility, losing contact with it could be disastrous. As they reached the upper circuit line, the water cleared slightly, revealing massive rock formations. Here, they corrected their buoyancy, adjusted their positions, and exchanged the universal OK hand signal. Michael flashed an OK sign in return. He felt good, confident. Then, they began their descent on the lower circuit line, deeper into the heart of the cave. As they dropped past 200 feet, the weight of the depths made itself known. Every breath required more effort, the compressed air feeling heavier in their lungs. The nitrogen in their tanks was turning against them, creeping into their systems and dulling their senses. This was nitrogen narcosis, a condition where breathing compressed air at great depths impairs judgment, slows reflexes, and clouds the mind like alcohol. Most divers experienced it below 130 feet, but beyond 200 feet, it became dangerously unpredictable. Halfway through the circuit, Daniel noticed something odd. Michael had drifted slightly below the guideline. It wasn't much, just a few feet at first, but then he descended faster, as if drawn downward by an invisible force. Daniel reached out, trying to get his attention, but Michael surged ahead, his movements sharp, erratic. He wasn't just following the guideline anymore. He was pushing beyond it. Was he chasing a personal depth record? Daniel felt a flash of concern. They were already near 250 feet, where the water pressed against them like an iron vise. The circuit would soon loop back toward the junction room, where they would have to re-enter the silted, low-visibility zone. Then, the moment everything changed. As they neared the junction room, the clear water vanished. A cloud of thick suspended sediment engulfed them, turning the cave into an endless void. The visibility dropped to nothing. Michael reached for the guideline, but his fingers missed it. A second attempt, another miss. Panic set in. Disoriented, he turned the wrong way, back into the cave instead of toward the exit. The moment Daniel passed into the murky water, he lost sight of his partner. Michael was gone. On the other hand, Michael was fighting for his life. His heart pounded in his chest as he spun in the water, searching for any sign of light, a line, a familiar landmark. The cave was swallowing him whole. He saw a thin rope floating in the distance. A guideline? Desperate, he followed it, unaware that it wasn't the correct path. He had wandered into the downstream ballroom, an isolated chamber deep in the system. By now, his body was struggling. The deeper he went, the harder it was to breathe. Carbon dioxide was building in his bloodstream, a side effect of overexertion at extreme depths. The more he breathed, the worse it got. His regulator, the device controlling his air supply, delivered oxygen, but it couldn't eliminate the creeping blackout forming at the edges of his vision. This was depth-induced blackout, one of the deadliest threats to deep divers. Then, the final mistake. His buoyancy was failing. Slowly, his body tipped forward, his weight dragging him downward. He blacked out before he ever hit the bottom. Meanwhile, Daniel had surfaced. His lungs burned from the required decompression stops, pausing at specific depths to allow nitrogen to leave the bloodstream and avoid decompression sickness, also known as the bends. This happens when a diver ascends too quickly, causing dissolved nitrogen in the bloodstream to form bubbles. At high pressures underwater, the body absorbs nitrogen from breathing gas. If a diver surfaces too fast, the nitrogen doesn't have time to safely leave the body and forms bubbles in tissues and blood vessels. Symptoms range from joint pain, dizziness, and fatigue to paralysis or even death in severe cases. To prevent this, divers make decompression stops, pausing at specific depths to allow nitrogen to safely exit the body. Treatment typically involves oxygen therapy or a hyperbaric chamber, which helps dissolve the bubbles by simulating a gradual ascent. Daniel, at his 30-foot stop, hovered, scanning the basin for any sign of Michael. He couldn't see him anywhere. By now, he had realized that something was wrong. By the time he surfaced, other divers had arrived. They re-entered the cave, following the guideline back to the junction room, but Michael was nowhere to be found. The recovery operation began early the next morning as a team of highly trained cave divers assembled at the site. Given the extreme depths and poor visibility inside Deipolder's sink, the operation required a carefully coordinated effort. 3 teams of specialists, including expert recovery divers, decompression experts, and surface support personnel, prepared for the challenging descent. The search would not be easy. The cave system was vast, and any disturbance of the silt could instantly reduce visibility to near zero. The first team entered the water, following the guideline leading to the junction room. From there, they carefully navigated into the lower circuit, moving in slow, deliberate motions to avoid stirring up silt. As they reached the deeper sections of the cave, the cold and pressure became more apparent. At 200 feet, they switched to their deep gas supply, keeping close watch on their dive computers, which tracked their depth, gas consumption, and required decompression time. Minutes turned into hours as the teams methodically searched the cave. Finally, at 241 feet, one of the divers' lights revealed a motionless figure on the bottom. Michael lay face down, his arms relaxed at his sides, his regulator still in his mouth. His mask was intact, showing no signs of a struggle, an indication that he had likely blacked out before he even realized he was in trouble. There were no signs of struggle. He had simply lost consciousness and drifted downward, his oxygen tank still half full. It took 7 hours to find him. Although they already knew the end result, they were all devastated when they found out what they suspected was actually true. Michael was gone. The rescue team secured his body and made their way towards the surface. The diving community mourned the loss of Michael. He had been young, talented, and ambitious, perhaps too ambitious. Those who knew him recalled how he often pushed himself, eager to match the veterans. Experts reviewing the accident concluded that Michael had likely been affected by nitrogen narcosis and depth-induced blackout, made worse by carbon dioxide buildup from exertion. Losing the guideline had been the critical mistake. Had he used a mixed gas setup, like Trimix, a combination of oxygen, nitrogen, and helium, the effects of narcosis might have been reduced. But Michael had relied on compressed air, which became treacherous beyond 200 feet. In the end, it wasn't just a single error that cost him his life. It was a cascade of small, deadly mistakes, compounded by the merciless nature of the deep. Deipolder sink had claimed another victim, and the depths would keep their secrets. This next story will put you at unease, since the cavers went through something they had never would have imagined. On August 17, 1996, a group of experienced cavers prepared for another day of exploration at a newly discovered cave in Tennessee that had already begun revealing its secrets. Rogers, Jack, Gerald, Fico, and Alan had spent the previous day digging through debris to open a narrow passage deep within the cave system. Today they planned to push further, hoping to uncover uncharted tunnels that could lead to even greater discoveries. Cave exploration was more than a hobby to these men. It was an obsession. The thrill of crawling through the Earth's hidden chambers, squeezing through impossibly tight spaces, and uncovering passages untouched by human hands was what drove them. But with the thrill came real danger. The weight of the Earth above them was a constant reminder that caves were unpredictable. And in a place like Hero Bucket Horror Hole, the risk of collapse was always present. The entrance to Hero Bucket Horror Hole was unassuming, a narrow opening hidden in a wooded hillside, leading down into the darkness. The team moved with practiced precision, each carrying their own specialized gear: helmets fitted with high-powered headlamps, knee and elbow pads for crawling, gloves, and rock hammers for clearing debris. The deeper they went, the dustier the air became. Reaching the worksite, they assessed the passage they had dug the previous day. The walls were rough and unstable, with chunks of loose rock scattered around from their excavation efforts. It wasn't perfect, but it was passable. Now they had to go through a new passage they had discovered the previous day. It was a narrow tunnel that inclined downwards, hardly had enough space for a single person to fit through comfortably. According to their years of experience, they knew that, although the space was tight, it wasn't a threat and no one's going to get stuck inside. Perhaps they weren't prepared for what would happen next. Jack went in first. He maneuvered his body into the crawl space, turning onto his left shoulder to fit. The tunnel was barely 2 feet high, but not wide enough for him to get through on his stomach, forcing him to flatten himself in that position as much as possible. He inched forward slowly, pressing against the rough limestone floor while pushing off with his feet. His chest scraped against the ceiling and every breath felt compressed. Rogers followed. He shifted his body to the same position. Lying on his right shoulder, his body twisted awkwardly. The tunnel was too tight to move normally, so he had to drag himself forward using only his left arm, while pressing his boots against the walls to gain traction. The further in he went, the more constricted the space became. Ahead of him, Jack had stopped. The path ahead was blocked. Loose rocks had collapsed into the passage overnight, forming a dense barricade of jagged debris. Disappointed, he told Rogers they had had to break them in order to move ahead. Rogers tried to reach for the tool strapped to his belt, but the tight walls made movement difficult. He twisted his arm painfully until he could grip the handle. He passed it forward, and Jack started chipping away at the rock, sending small clouds of dust floating back toward Rogers. The air became thick, and he coughed as fine debris coated his throat. While they focused on clearing the path, they remained oblivious to the deadly trap they were unknowingly setting for themselves. In mere minutes, the situation would spiral from nothing to catastrophic. A deep, gut-wrenching crack echoed through the passage as the slab of limestone behind Rogers suddenly peeled away from the wall. It was a massive chunk, loosened by their previous digging efforts, and now, with nothing to hold it in place, gravity took over. The boulder slammed downward, crashing against the floor with an earth-shaking thud. Dust and fragments of rock exploded into the air, momentarily blinding those outside the passage. The force knocked both Jack and Rogers forward, slamming Jack's head against the stones. His helmet absorbed most of the blow, but the shock left him disoriented. When he regained his senses, he realized something horrifying had happened. The rockfall had completely sealed the passage behind them. They had nowhere to go. The loose debris ahead still blocked their path, and now the only way out was gone. For a split second, nobody moved. Then came the realization. Jack and Rogers were trapped. Miraculously, Rogers wasn't crushed outright. As the slab fell, it pushed him forward, shoving him clear of its full weight just before it hit the ground. If he had been even a few inches further back, he would have been pinned against the floor, possibly killed instantly. However, they were still in deep trouble. The dust coating their throats was suffocating them, and since they were trapped with nowhere to go, the anxiety crept in. Rogers tried to push against the rock, but there was no space to move, trapped on all sides. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, drowning out everything else. Jack shifted slightly, trying to find room, but the cave walls pressed in. His breathing was fast, uneven, and the more he tried to slow it, the worse it got. Their bodies were pinned, unable to shift more than an inch, the rock sealing them in like a coffin. Panic crept in, the dizzying, suffocating fear of being trapped with no escape. They felt claustrophobic, and the anxiety made the nightmare even worse. But soon they realized panic was the enemy in tight spaces. They started telling themselves they'll get out of it and encouraged each other to sit tight and believe in their companions. The others rushed to assess the situation, and the team sprang into action. Caving rescues were notoriously difficult. Any attempt to move large debris in a confined space risked triggering further collapses. Every decision had to be made carefully. Monty, knowing they needed better tools, immediately exited the cave and ran to a nearby friend's house, where he borrowed a large sledgehammer. In the meantime, the others began working with what they had: rock hammers, crowbars, and chisels, chipping away at the edges of the massive slab in an attempt to weaken it. Inside the passage, now both Rogers and Jack kept their cool. They knew that if they hyperventilated, their bodies would consume oxygen too quickly. If they moved too much, they might dislodge more unstable rock. They focused on slow, steady breathing, conserving energy as they listened to the sounds of his friends breaking away the stone that held him prisoner. The work was slow and exhausting. Every swing of the sledgehammer sent shockwaves through the rock, causing small fractures, but not enough to break it completely. The confined space meant that only 1 or 2 people could work on the slab at a time, forcing them to take turns to avoid fatigue. The biggest concern was vibrations. Too much force could send more rock tumbling from the ceiling. They had to be strategic, breaking off manageable chunks while keeping the surrounding structure intact. Outside the cave, the afternoon sun had begun to set, but inside, time had lost all meaning. The only light came from their headlamps, sweat mixing with cave mud as they worked tirelessly. Rogers, still recovering from his close call, joined in when he could, using a hammer and chisel to chip away at the edges of the fallen rock. Finally, after 4 grueling hours, Ficco delivered the final blow, a carefully placed strike that sent a deep fracture through the middle of the slab. With one last push, they managed to break it apart into smaller sections, clearing enough space for Rogers to wiggle free. Jack followed. The moment he emerged, a wave of relief washed over the group. They had done it. The reality of how close they had come to tragedy was setting in. They realized that virgin passages, newly opened tunnels, were inherently unstable, and any signs of loose rock needed to be taken seriously. Digging through debris might open new paths, but it also weakened the surrounding structure. For Rogers and Jack, it was a terrifying experience, but one that only deepened their respect for the unpredictable world beneath the earth.